everyone who's starting to join us tonight. My name is Rob Lyman, and I'll be joined tonight by Stephen White, who will actually be doing most of the talking, thankfully. We'll just wait a few moments before we start to allow people to log on from around the world. We've got a really good group of people tonight, well, a large number of people tonight coming from all corners of the earth, which is really exciting. And we're really pleased that you're able to join us again for another Kohima Educational Trust webinar. We're really enjoying these, and we're looking forward to tonight very much. Charles Pawsey was quite a remarkable man, and we and the Naga people owe him a considerable debt. And as Sylvia will tell us at the end, we've got some really exciting webinars coming up in the next few months. So you've got 6 months of viewing excitement to look forward to. I see people are coming in, really nice to welcome you, and we hope you enjoy it. So James is dialing in from Ireland, that's cool. We've got people coming in from India and lots of other parts of the world. We've really enjoyed the last few months, and have decided that we need to make these a feature of our monthly business, and we're glad that you're continuing to support us. So we'll leave it a little bit longer before we let Sylvia take it away. There we are.
Well, hello everyone, and a big welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us this evening for another Kohima Educational Trust webinar. Tonight, the subject is Sir Charles Pawsey. You will all know about his role as the Deputy District Commissioner in Nagaland at the time of the Japanese invasion and subsequent Battle of Kohima. Perhaps less well known is his life before and after his time there, including an extremely distinguished active service in the First World War. Our speaker tonight is Steve White, Chairman of KET. Steve tells me that the combination of Nagas and Charles Pawsey is quite irresistible. Steve took a couple of papers on India while studying history at Cambridge many moons ago, and has kept an on-off eye on scholarly developments ever since. Steve has visited Nagaland a couple of times, and whilst he insists that he is no expert, the idea of researching Charles Pawsey was way too good to miss. It gave him a chance to return to the Centre of Southeast Asia, or South Asia Studies, at Cambridge, where Pawsey's papers are archived in order to research this quite extraordinary man. With us tonight, as always, is Dr. Robert Lyman. Rob, as I hope you all know, is a brilliant military historian and the author of many books, most recently, The War of Empires, which I'm going to say, if you haven't yet bought a copy, it's available on our online store right now. We will try and take questions at the end. If we don't have time for everyone, or you think of something afterwards, please do get in touch and we will answer by email. Now, as they say, without further ado, over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Well, tonight I'm going to be doing very little of the work. Most of the work will be done by Steve, but I'm just going to say a few words in terms of introduction. And many of you will know of Sir Charles Pawsey, but then again, many of you won't, because he's one of those unsung heroes of the Battle of Kohima that played a really considerable role in the British and Indian victory in March, April, May, June 1944, but yet is a name that very few people have heard of. He was a very significant individual, and one of the ways in which you can determine how significant he was by asking the Nagas why they fought. It's a very interesting exercise, and I've done it. And the answer to that question is Charles Pawsey. Well, tonight I'm very grateful for Steve to come and explain to us a little bit more about who this man was and the significance of his role in 1944. Steve, over to you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I've got to find the share screen, and there we are. This evening, I'm going to look at Pawsey's background, his years in the Indian Civil Service, his efforts to bring about a peaceful settlement to the insurrections that racked Naga land after the war. And I'll start with a brief review of what happened to him and to the Ridge during the siege. I'd like to thank a few people for helping me put this together. They're in alphabetical order. Charles Chasey has given me some wonderful ideas. Charlotte Carty, Rob Lyman, of course, Esme Mitchell, and Jan Nienu. Because of the terrain, the received wisdom in the British 14th Army was that it was impossible for a force larger than a regiment to make its way to the Imphal-Dimapur road from the far side of the Chindwin. But Ord Wingate's Operation Longcloth in the middle of 1943 kind of turned that on its head. And someone who had been sceptical was Lieutenant General Mutaguchi, who was the sponsor and architect of Operation Yugo. And he had a change of mind because of what he thought could be done. So they tried it. Confusion about the scale of the attack on Kohima led to confusion in its defense. Intelligence was contradictory during the 2 weeks leading up to the first contact and the start of the siege on the 4th of April. And right up to the 4th, Lieutenant General Bill Slim, the commanding officer of the 14th Army, was unsure whether Kohima or Dimapur was the principal objective of Lieutenant General Sato's 31st Division. The size of the Japanese force had become clearer during that fortnight, however, and Slim did know by the 4th of April that far from 2 or 3 battalions, the Japanese force advancing on Kohima was a division. Slim's balancing act was in the face of the obvious fact, stressed by Charles Pawsey, that the loss of the Kohima Ridge would be a significant setback to his plans to invade Burma and would as well give the Japanese a through route to Dimapur should they capture Imphal. And the map on the screen, there's a section which runs south to north if you're driving from Imphal, and that's the length of the ridge. So if you had artillery and tanks on that, you were able to trash anything in the way. It was a vital place. Before the arrival of 2 Div, Slim and his staff had to hedge their bets. The most battle-ready troops available were the 161st Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Warren, part of the 5th Indian Division. It was deployed to Kohima from Arakan, arriving on the 29th of March via Dimapur. But by the 2nd of April, Lieutenant General Montague Stopford, the commanding officer of the 14th Army's 33rd Corps, was convinced that Dimapur was indeed the objective, and he ordered 161st to hurry there. Those in Kohima, Brigadier Warren himself, Colonel Hugh Richards, the commanding officer of the scratch units in Kohima, and Pawsey were simply aghast. When Pawsey was told that Sato's 31st Division was outflanking Kohima en route for Dimapur, he was scornful and said, "If it was so, my Nagas would have told me." 161st left Kohima on the 3rd of April. The error was clear by the afternoon of the 4th, and the order to move to Dimapur rescinded. However, of the entire 161st, only 446 men of the 4th Royal West Kents got through the increasing stranglehold imposed by Sato's force, arriving on the Kohima Ridge on the 5th of April. And so the ridge was encircled. The story of the siege is one of enormous courage. The defenders on Garrison Hill began to be relieved when 2 Div started to arrive on the ridge on the 18th of April. But there were 2 crucial events that allowed the tiny British and Indian force on the ridge to hold out for a fortnight. One was the return of the 4th Royal West Kents on the 5th, and the other, 2 days earlier, was Charles Pawsey's decision to stay. The war came to Pawsey in February 1942, when he reported the passage of refugees following the collapse of Burma. As more and more arrived, he established food stations and shelter, but by July, the flood was a trickle, and Kohima returned somewhat warily to its easygoing existence. There was comfort that the nearest significant Japanese armed force was the other side of the vertiginous mountains and across the Chindwin River. Little did anyone suspect. From September 1943, Pawsey was reporting that Japanese patrols were infiltrating and attempting to suborn villages, sometimes with violence. For example, one of his assistant commissioners reported in January 1944 that he feared 2 villages might be prepared to help the Japanese. Another straw in the wind was the party Pawsey threw for the officers of the 1st Assam Regiment on the 23rd of February 1944. The evening before, they were due to leave for Jessamy and Karason. Nurses from the hospital were invited, but any attempt at levity was watered down by an order from the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bruno Brown, that full battle dress would be worn, not a phony war there then. Colonel Richards wrote later, Kohima was a staging post, a supply base and a reinforcement camp on the line of communication for the 14th Army. Kohima itself contained vast quantities of stores and ammunition, workshops, transport companies, bakery, pioneer company, Indian General Hospital, and a reinforcement camp. It was also the HQ of 3rd Assam Rifles and the HQ of the Shear Regiment, a state troops battalion, employed at that time on patrol work. In addition, there were details of signals and Royal Engineers. There were few fighting troops. Richards doesn't account for the small civilian population of Kohima, some of them the staff of the Deputy Commissioner. As a civilian, it would have been entirely proper, indeed preferable, for Pawsey to leave Kohima on the 2nd of April with other non-combatants, or with the 161st, but he stayed throughout the siege. The sense is that he stayed because of everything he believed in, most importantly, the British duty towards the Nagas. As 161st pulled out, Pawsey was the only tangible justification to the Nagas that the British were not leaving them to their fate. Pawsey had called Nagas from surrounding districts to the ridge to support the small British and Indian force. If they had left, it's very unlikely that the few troops on the ridge would have held out until 2 Div arrived. Once the Royal West Kents returned, the British and Indian population of the Kohima Ridge was about 2,500 men, of whom about 1,500 were combat troops. The other 1,000 included non-combat troops, stores, medical, etc., and some civilians who were unable to leave before the siege closed in. Pawsey believed the Japanese lost the initiative early on. If they pressed their advantage on the 5th and the 6th, they should have taken the ridge. The hair whisker of Allied success during the next fortnight was buoyed by the expectation of relief from 2 Div, but was, as Wellington would have said, a damn near-run thing. The Assam regimental history mentions Pawsey calling out Angami Nagas from Kohima village to help strengthen the defence position before the siege. Quote, his advice and guidance to the military commanders was invaluable, and his association with the 1st Battalion, as indeed with the Assam Regiment in general, was looked upon with pride and endeared him to all ranks. Pawsey toured the besieged area daily, quote, in a trilby hat with an umbrella and 2 Naga spearmen in escort. An Indian officer in the Assam Rifles wrote about an unarmed civilian in the midst of all the carnage, a more unruffled man one could not imagine, a source of inspiration. Private Ray Street wrote later, he was a kind chap and moved around the hill, lifting our spirits as he moved between the trenches and the battalion HQ. He stopped and talked to us, saying that relief would get through, and told us not to worry too much. He seemed without fear of bullets and shells as he strolled along in the open, as if defying the enemy. Nagas slipped in and out. Pawsey was able to keep Hugh Richards informed of what was happening beyond their perimeter. He also argued the Naga cause with the military, as when the artillery of the 161st, positioned in Jotsama after failing to return to the ridge, fired on the Naga village. As 2 Div drew nearer, that's complicated, as 2 Div drew nearer, it became possible from the 18th of April to evacuate the wounded and officers. Pawsey left then and went to Dimapur to help manage supplies and refugees. Later, once the Japanese had been pushed further south out of the Kohima area, he had to rebuild courts, markets, medical facilities, and much more. He probably knew that when they'd been pushed further south out of the Kohima area, he had to rebuild courts, medical facilities, and more. He probably knew that the Naga Hills would never be the same again. He toured refugee camps, helping displaced families. He was also asked repeatedly for information on lost men, such as Captain A.N. Lunn, who died on Jay Hill. Pawsey wrote, "So far, the Graves regimental officer has not found his body. I'm told he was with a V-Force officer called Gould, and his body has not been found. His mother is continually inquiring about his grave, and I've not been able to find anyone who knows where it is." Pawsey was angry when the press wrote disparaging articles about the Nagas. He would make it clear to anyone who listened that they were loyal to the British and had served with extraordinary bravery and commitment, refusing any pay. Brigadier Frederick Loftus Tottenham of the 33rd Indian Corps congratulated the Indian Civil Service, saying that Naga-led intelligence was excellent, with no instance of false information and no instance of Naga support for Japs except under duress. Nagas managed to confuse the Japanese, captured more Japanese than British units, aided lost and escaped troops, and never wavered with their natural courage. He commended the ICS for its considerate governance. Slim wrote a letter of thanks to Pawsey on the 25th of June, with a request to pass on thanks to tribal chiefs and vague assurance of benefits to come. Lord Louis Mountbatten, here on the right-hand side with Pawsey and Nagas, was impressed that the Nagas had done everything in their power to help us and volunteered to carry our wounded back under fire, proudly refusing any pay. True friends of the British, and we must do everything we can for them. This was on the 1st of July when he visited Kohima. Whatever his intentions, very little was in fact done. On the left, you'll see Viceroy Viscount Wavell with his wife, who visited Kohima in August. After it was all over, and after the war, Pawsey stayed on as Deputy Commissioner and oversaw the construction of a new Kohima and the war cemetery, and of course, he needed a new bungalow. But just think, as Pawsey stood next to Colonel Hugh Richards, bidding farewell to Brigadier Warren and the 161st, he must have thought he'd be dead within a week. The intelligence he received every day from Nagas about the size of the Japanese force and its objective was accurate, and he knew the skimpy resources on the ridge were insufficient for much more than a couple of days' resistance. And he had an honourable route to safety. But he stayed because in his eyes that was his duty, both to Britain and possibly more importantly to the Nagas. Perhaps he felt that if he stayed, he'd be killed, but if he left, he could never live with himself. He'd seen awful slaughter on the Western Front where, as many others have recorded, he awoke each morning surprised to still be alive. It wasn't so much a numbness to death, but a kind of patience. Now I want to look at his early years. He was born in Surbiton on the 14th of July, 1894. Surbiton was originally called Kingston upon Railway. He grew up after the railway to Waterloo arrived in 1838. Kingston upon Thames, like many towns with a sense of their own grandeur, didn't want a railway station, but relented in 1869 and had a branch line. They lived there because Pawsey's father, who was also called Charles, would have taken the train to London, where he was a paymaster-in-chief of the Royal Navy. There are up to 10 paymasters-in-chief, a rank in the accountant branch of the Royal Navy, each at that time on the retired list following a successful career in the Navy. His mother was Ellen Edith Offord. Our Charles attended Berkhamsted School in Hertfordshire, where he was a decent athlete and served in the Cadet Corps. He went up to Wadham College, Oxford, in October 1913 to read classics and graduated in 1918. The quicker view will have noticed that during those years he was probably fighting in the First World War, and he was. He spent most of the intervening time either fighting or as a prisoner of war. But he graduated in 1918 as DDH, which is declared to have deserved honours, a formula still in use today to recognise that a student would have passed finals if only they'd sat them. Pawsey's excuse was unarguable, especially with an MC and bar. When I rang Wadham College to find if I could talk to the archivist, I talked to a man called Geoffrey Hackney, who was a retired law don, but still a fellow of Wadham. And he told me that, yes, indeed, Pawsey had been there and that he graduated DDH and so on. And then I said, oh, well, he was a great man. And he said, yes, I know little of him. And I said, and he came up to you from Berkhamsted School. And he said, Berkhamsted School, Berkhamsted, Wadham, and an MC and bar. What a man. So there we are. Made his day, I think. While he should have been a student, of course, he was a soldier. He volunteered soon after war was declared and joined the Worcestershire Regiment as a territorial officer, and in April 1915 joined the 7th and 8th Battalions that had landed at Boulogne the previous month as part of the Gloucester and Worcester Brigade in the South Midland Division. He fought on the Western Front in the region of Serres, winning the MC in January 1916 while a temporary lieutenant for repeatedly recovering wounded men from no man's land. He spoke later of clearing the dead from Serres, from the trenches. He was gassed and invalided to recuperate, and the following year he was awarded a bar to his MC in June as a temporary captain, fighting near Templo, still along the Somme section, but not during the Somme offensive, either MC, one before and one after. In November 1917, his brigade was ordered to Italy in support of the Italian army reeling from the fiasco of the Battle of Caporetto. Pawsey's battalion fought on the Asiago Plateau above Lake Garda against the Austro-Hungarians. He was captured during hand-to-hand fighting and spent the last year of the war in a POW camp. With news of the armistice, he and some other prisoners commandeered a train and chuffed south to freedom. He resigned his TA commission in September 1921 by when he was in India. Pawsey joined the Indian Civil Service in 1919. An uncle had served as a collector in East Bengal, which both before and after the partition of Bengal in 1905 would have included the Naga Hills. The governance of British India developed over 350 years until independence in 1946. Here's a little bit of history. From its foundation in 1600, the East India Company, known to all as the Company, set up trading posts or factories in several locations, mostly along the coast, with the consent of local rulers, including the Mughal and Maratha empires. The company was licensed by the English Crown to trade in the Far East as an English monopoly. The risks were huge, fighting competing monopoly companies from the Netherlands, Portugal, Denmark and France, fighting Indian states, the climate and disease, the risk of death at sea. It made some sense to have a state back one company that could, at no cost to the Crown, promote England while bringing back riches. By the mid-18th century, Madras, Bombay and Calcutta had become the principal seats of company power and were known as presidency towns. The model, if it's a model of empire at all, is more Greek than Roman, more trading outposts than anything else at this stage. At its zenith, during the second half of the 18th century, the company controlled half the world's trade and had an army twice the size of the British Army. In proportional terms, the largest corporation ever known. The transfer of extraordinary wealth from India to Britain, together with that from the Caribbean slave plantations, funded the Industrial Revolution and created the financial institutions that by the 19th century dominated world commerce. The map shows small patches around the northeast and east and also around Bombay where the company had a hold. This was in 1805. The rest was still under the control of the Maratha or the other empires other states. But there was increasing sense by 1805 that the lot was under the overall control of a British hegemony. The first phase of British interest in India ended with the 7 Years' War that began in 1756. The reach of the war was across Europe, the Americas, Africa and South Asia, and by its end, French military power in India and North America was broken. In India, the power of both the Mughal and Maratha empires waned, and the company became paramount. It now governed territory, collected taxes, and imposed its law and order, this time more Roman than Greek. During this period of company rule between the 7 Years' War and the Great Indian Rebellion of 1857, it gradually acquired sovereignty over large parts of India, now called presidencies, centred on the 3 presidency towns. However, it also increasingly came under British government oversight, especially with the East India Company Act in 1784, which in effect forced the company to share sovereignty with the Crown. The company had become too big for its boots. It gradually lost its mercantile privileges, and knives were out in London to strip the company of some or all of its powers. Often it was a pawn in a wider political fight, as when the first Governor-General, Warren Hastings, was impeached in 1787. The company caught the flak for the failure of the governance that led to the Great Rebellion, and the company's remaining powers were transferred to the Crown. The British Empire in India became known as the Raj, and from 1858 to 1947, administrative boundaries were extended to include a few other British administrative regions, such as Upper Burma. Increasingly, however, the unwieldy presidencies were broken up into provinces. The Indian Civil Service was formed in 1858 to manage the Raj on behalf of the Crown. How could 1,200 British rule 290 million people? The answer is that they weren't alone. The ICS employed Indians from early on in junior roles, and from 1919, in the face of declining British interest in careers in the ICS exam for access to the highest levels was open to all. At the turn of the 20th century, British India consisted of 8 provinces that were administered either by a governor, a lieutenant governor, or a chief commissioner. Assam province was the smallest, for example, a third the size of Bengal by area, with just 6 million people compared to 75 million in Bengal. Assam province included today's states of Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, and note that Manipur and Tripura were princely states. Pawsey was appointed to the Assam province, and after a period of induction in the capital Shillong, was posted to the Naga hills. He wrote about the 3 stages of his Indian Civil Service career. Firstly, Assistant Commissioner, starting at Provincial HQ in Shillong for induction, followed by work on land settlement surveys. Then Assistant Commissioner, Subdivisional Officer, responsible for a subdivision of a district, reporting to a Deputy Commissioner who had charge of a district. In other parts of India, a Deputy Commissioner may be referred to as a District Commissioner, District Magistrate, or District Collector, titles that better describe the job. The word deputy was used in Assam, where the head of the province was known before 1919 as Commissioner rather than Governor. The title of District Commissioner was also loosely used in Assam. Pawsey's boss when he arrived in Kohima was John Henry Hutton. Hutton joined the ICS in 1909. He was Deputy Commissioner in the Naga Hills when Pawsey arrived, before becoming Census Commissioner in New Delhi in 1929. He left the ICS in 1937 for Cambridge University, where he became the William Wise Professor of Social Anthropology. He'd already made his name with 2 seminal works on Naga ethnography, the Angami Nagas and the Sema Nagas, for which he received a DSc from Oxford. During their time together in the Naga Hills, Hutton and Pawsey worked closely together, and Hutton's influence on the younger man is clear. Hutton's attitude towards the Naga people is reflected during official discussions about the formulation of the Government of India Act in 1935. Hutton worked with some success to protect the interests of tribal minorities, despite opposition from Indian nationalists who suspected that it was a scheme intended to divide the country. Arriving in Kohima in 1920 as an assistant commissioner, Pawsey noticed that the formality of the provincial capital Shillong was replaced by a relaxed attitude towards Nagas with mutual trust and more informality. On tours of 2 or 3 months through the district, the pace of progress from one village to another was leisurely, with a caravan of furniture and a kitchen. Pawsey wrote about his time with Hutton: cold weather camping, early morning duck shooting, Sunday pig sticking and snipe shooting, days spent visiting villages, settling land disputes on the spot. Pawsey was posted elsewhere for a few years and experienced the tea garden riots in Assam and non-cooperation in Kamrup. He was a sub-divisional officer in Mangaldoy after returning to the Naga Hills as sub-divisional officer at the end of 1923, and again under Hutton, participating in a trans-frontier tour to confirm borders between India and Burmese districts, all with a minimum of fuss. Porters were hired from village to village. They travelled with a small contingent of Assam Rifles. The two men worked together for a few more years until 1929, when Hutton left for New Delhi. Pawsey had happy memories of his time working with him, resolving intertribal disputes, fishing in the Doyang River, courts in camp including rice beer, chicken and eggs from the headman, and rum and cheroots from Hutton. Pawsey wrote that Hutton had influence over the Nagas because he was honest, had no desire for personal gain, fought for the betterment of Nagas, took the time to understand, helped eradicate leprosy by instituting strict quarantine, and Naga Hills was the first district to register every opium user and restrain consumption. Hutton was succeeded as Deputy Commissioner by J.P. Mills, the ornithologist and anthropologist who later became Reader in Language and Culture at SOAS. Pawsey reported to him before being appointed Director of Land Records in 1932. He became Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills himself in 1935. Hutton's influence on Pawsey was profound and marked. Pawsey wrote of him in a biographical essay, "He was a good man." I'm sure he was. As Deputy Commissioner, life was simple, but for a man of Pawsey's temperament, very attractive. He had a staff of head of police, junior magistrates, civil surgeon, chief engineer, forestry management, and other admin and domestic staff. They lived and worked in compounds along the length of Kohima Ridge, among the stores, workshops, clinic, jail, and other buildings. The climate was healthy at a little over 4,000 feet. Those like Pawsey who liked life in Kohima liked it a lot. You all know about Pawsey's compound with its red roof bungalow and tennis court. Today that part of the ridge is known as Garrison Hill. Then it was known as Summerhouse Hill. With its wide veranda and pretty garden of pink cannas and rhododendrons, it was simple yet sufficient. The tennis court was higher up the hill. It's interesting that the road down the steep slope to the traffic control point on the Imphal-Dimapur road was paid for out of Pawsey's own pocket because the ICS wouldn't, because of regulations. Kohima had a population of about 3,500. The Naga Hills altogether had a population of about 200,000, roughly the size of Milton Keynes, and an area of about 6,500 square miles, which, for those of you who measure land in the traditional way, is about 3/4 the size of Wales. As he had done in support of Hutton, Pawsey and his assistant commissioners travelled widely to villages across the Naga Hills, almost always with a Naga escort. He was a fluent speaker of Nagamese, the lingua franca that evolved from Assamese and allowed Nagas from different tribes to converse. He would have with him Dobashis, official translators, who rendered the local languages into Nagamese or English. Tours took 2 to 3 months, settling legal and land disputes and reporting on the state of roads, bridges and bungalows, and collecting taxes. They'd stay in government bungalows or with planters. Pat Smythe was the daughter of the manager of a coal mine in Nagaland and remembered Pawsey holding his magistrate court on their veranda. Boundary disputes were common, as were murders that could lead to vendettas unless handled tactfully. She remembered one police sergeant emptying a sack of heads at Pawsey's feet. The government of India expected a district commissioner to keep the law and collect the taxes. They were sorted by Guanaburas, officially appointed headmen, who were expected to manage the collection of taxes and be the first line of law and order. Nagas expected to be left alone with good grace. Every village was reassessed every 2 years for tax. A game played between the British official and the Guanabura. Wealthy widows arrived in rags, and the Guanabura attempted to deflect attention from her land. Of interest later was the water supply. Those who have visited Nagaland will know that there's plenty of water, but drinking water had to be managed. Feeding the tank in Pawsey's compound was a pipe with springs from Aradura Spur, all very well in peacetime. Other than the DC's bungalow and tennis court, there was a clubhouse for the British residents of the Ridge, whether civil or military. Vegetables were grown, meat was bought, some luxuries brought up from Dimapur. Were men like Pawsey and Hutton rare? In a memoir of her time in the Kashar Hills between Kohima and Shillong, Ursula Graham Bowers wrote about government aloofness and indifference. It's hard to imagine anyone doing the job of Deputy Commissioner better than Pawsey. Pawsey left India in 1948. He was 54. While in service with the ICS, he was made a Companion of the Star of India and a Companion of the Indian Empire. In 1947, the Royal Society for Asian Affairs awarded him the Lawrence of Arabia Medal. This was instituted in 1935 and is awarded intermittently in recognition of work of outstanding merit in the fields of exploration, research, or literature. Recipients include Sir John Glubb, Glubb Pasha, Ord Wingate, Ursula Graham Bauer, who received the medal 3 years before Pawsey, John Hunt, Wilfrid Thesiger, Max Mallowan, Chris Bonington, and Colin Thubron. Pawsey was knighted in the 1948 New Year's Honours Lists. These awards show the high and public regard in which Pawsey was held immediately after the war and at the time of independence. He was not a faceless and forgotten Indian administrator. His deeds were acknowledged at the highest level. In 1954, at the age of 60, Pawsey married Rita, the widow of Hugh Ingle Halliday. Halliday had served with the Sussex Regiment in World War I and later in the Assam Rifles. Pawsey and his new wife settled near Woodbridge in Suffolk, in the village of Baddingham, where his family originated. He became a gentleman farmer. His personal correspondence is preserved in his archives in Cambridge and reveals a man with wide interests and many friends. Yet far from relaxing into a comfortable retirement, he felt pulled into Naga affairs. By the time of the siege, Pawsey, like so many in the CIS and the Indian Army, had known for some years that India would be independent soon, although he probably wouldn't have guessed as early as 1947. He also knew only too well that most Nagas thought of being incorporated into an independent India. Before he left his post at independence, he'd done what he could to help Nagas achieve sufficient autonomy to be able to live undisturbed by Delhi. However, the moderate approach he proposed was not widely accepted. By the end of World War I, the Raj had ceased to be an asset to Britain, but the emotional pull of empire stopped many viewing the problem as rationally as perhaps they might. There were, as a result, successive attempts to settle the question of Indian governments once and for all. Meanwhile, Naga tribes increasingly understood that they had a great deal more in common than they would have acknowledged in the late 19th century at the start of British involvement in the Naga Hills. Tribes had always had a sense of common ancestry, but were independent of one another. The hilly terrain isolated villages and resulted in the plethora of different languages. Improvements in communication and the integrating effect of ICS administration played their part. However, a significant step towards a sense of Naga nationhood came with the First World War. Many Nagas, along with other citizens of the Raj, joined the British war effort in 1914-18 and served on the Western Front as soldiers, porters, and orderlies. Amongst them grew an appreciation of the similarity between Naga tribes in contrast to other Indians. The idea formed of consolidating this into a meaningful organisation to press for Naga values and needs. After the war, and on returning to Nagaland, they met others who felt the same. Naga government officials and others founded the Naga Club along the lines of the British clubhouse on Garrison Hill. Eventually, the streams of interest coalesced, and the Naga Club took on a more political tone. There was clearly a sense that if there was Indian unrest at Britain's position in India, Nagas needed a body to clarify their own political demands and to represent themselves in the event of the end of British rule. The Naga Club was the body that petitioned the Simon Commission in 1928. The Simon Commission, comprising 7 British parliamentarians, toured India in 1928 with a remit to review the workings of the 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms that had introduced a lopsided power-sharing structure. However, the Simon Commission was boycotted by the Congress Party and the Muslim League and continually met with protest. 2 significant outcomes of the Simon Commission were, firstly, it proposed representative government in provinces, although British governors could retain much of their emergency powers, and secondly, one of its numbers was Clement Attlee, later Prime Minister of the post-war Labour government, and he became convinced of the need for Indian independence with dominion status akin to Australia, New Zealand and Canada. Naga representatives met the Simon Commission and submitted a memorandum in 1929, including the following very striking words. Quote, "We pray that the British government will continue to safeguard our rights against all encroachment from other people who are more advanced than us by withdrawing their country from the proposed reform scheme and placing us directly under its own protection. If the British government, however, wants to throw us away, we pray that we should not be thrust to the mercy of the people who could never subjugate us, but to leave us alone to determine for ourselves as in ancient times." The demand was clearly a no to incorporation within a future independent India. The Simon Commission's recommendations eventually resulted in the Government of India Act of 1935, greater autonomy for the provinces, but with reserved powers, introduction of direct elections that raised the franchise from 7 million to 35 million people, membership of the provisional assemblies altered to include any number of elected Indian representatives, establishment of a federal court, and most importantly for the Nagas, the establishment of excluded areas, districts that didn't fit well into the religious and cultural confines of the province within which they sat. Excluded areas were administered directly by the provincial governors and were not subject to laws passed by the newly created provincial legislature, although the governors could impose any law he liked on the excluded areas. However, it recognised that excluded areas, such as the Naga Hills, required a different mode of governance than most of the Raj. However, all the good intentions, the implementation of the Act after it came into force in 1937 was diluted, firstly by the opposition of both the Congress Party and the Muslim League. Nehru, on the left, called it a machine with strong brakes but no engine. He also called it a charter of slavery. Jinnah, on the right, called it thoroughly rotten, fundamentally bad, and totally unacceptable. The 2 gentlemen seem to be getting on quite well there. The second handicap to full implementation was the onset of war. But in the minds of Nagas, it established a footing for some form of separate status. The war interfered with the Naga Club as much as anything by removing its salient focus, and by 1945 the Naga Club needed, if not reviving, then boosting. The man who gave it impetus was Charles Pawsey, who was instrumental in the creation of the Naga Hills District Tribal Council. In 1946, the NHDTC evolved into the Naga National Council and took on an even more political stance, still under Pawsey's patronage. Pawsey was clear as was the Nagas' political leadership, that Nagas had to have a voice that was loud enough to be heard. A united organisation could put pressure on the British administration and on the Congress Party. Pawsey had a simple view of what Nagas could achieve. He thought that independence was impractical because of scale, economics, and tribal stresses, and that crown colony status was vanishingly unlikely. His advice, therefore, was unwelcome to many Nagas. Negotiate the best deal possible within the new India. As he said, quote, independence will mean tribal warfare, no hospitals, no schools, no salt, no trade with the plains, and general unhappiness. He hoped that the Naga Hills Tribal District Council and later the Naga National Council could focus Naga minds on determining what was practical and show the Congress Party that Nagas were serious. Others saw the difficulty faced by the Nagas too, including the Oxford historian of empire, Sir Reginald Coupland, who in 1945 suggested crown colony status for an amalgamated northeast. Neither Nagas nor the Labour government in London liked the idea, but it does show that others were trying to find a path. Hints in an August 1946 exchange of letters between Nehru and T. Sakri, the Naga National Council secretary, that some form of home rule might be on offer led nowhere. In June 1947, Sir Akbar Hyderabad, governor of Assam, negotiated a 9-point agreement, the Hyderabad Agreement, with the NNC that recognised the right of the Nagas to develop themselves according to their freely expressed wishes. But it was a dead document almost as soon as the ink was dry. During a meeting in July 1947 in Delhi between the NNC delegation and Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhi offered support for independence if that was what Nagas wanted, and that, should the Indian government oppose Nagas with violence, he would come to Kohima and will be the first to be shot before any Nagas are killed. Sadly, he himself was assassinated just 6 months later. It's not hard to see why Nagas were confused. The central issue was that Nagas didn't want to be ruled by Indians, and the Indian government, whether in waiting or after independence, in actuality, wouldn't tolerate anything short of the country's borders as the British left them. The crisis of partition and the creation of Pakistan only hardened the Congress Party's resolve, not to mention the Northeast's borders with China and Burma, which were politically critical. Meanwhile, in London, the Attlee government had enough on its plate to be bothered with what would have looked like the smallest detail in the hurried settlement to end the Raj. Missteps on both sides gave an opening to Naga radicals who saw violence as the only option. The NNC split into the overground faction that wanted to continue politics in the open with negotiation, and the underground faction led by the veteran Angami Zapul Faizo. When the British left India, Faizo wanted Naga independence. He failed to convince every faction in the Naga National Council, but through his ever-growing influence, he managed to make his belief in an independent Nagaland mainstream. His influence grew, and he was elected chairman of the NNC in late 1949. The NNC opposed the provisions for the Naga Hills set out in the new independent Indian constitution, published in 1950. This asserted that the Naga Hills was a tribal district that should continue to be subordinate to the newly formed state of Assam. Faizo's 3 meetings with Prime Minister Nehru during 1951 and 1952 were unable to find a compromise, and frustration towards the Indian government grew within Nagaland. However, the day when Delhi and the NNC lost the opportunity to negotiate a reasonable settlement was the 30th of March, 1953. Nehru had invited the Prime Minister of Burma, Takin-u-Nu, to meet at Kohima. On the agenda was a joint approach to Naga aspirations, either side of the border, which affected both countries, and the two leaders had it in their gift to make a settlement. A large Naga crowd had gathered in Kohima, thinking or wanting to meet Nehru and present their case. The then Deputy Commissioner of Kohima, fearing possible trouble, refused any audience or presentation of representation to Nehru. The Naga response was typical. If he wouldn't listen to us, why should we listen to him? The large crowd melted away from the meeting ground, with many smacking their bottoms as they left, which I imagine is the similar response to Two Fingers in England. The humiliation Nehru felt was so great, especially in front of his Burmese counterpart, that he vowed never to visit Kohima again, and never did. The immediate result was the promulgation of the Assam Maintenance of Order Autonomous Districts Act in 1953 to deal with the Nagas. This was followed by ever more stringent, even draconian legislation. Violent conflict was just a matter of time. Thus was the bitterness that led to such bloodshed born. Pawsey founded the insurgent People's Sovereign Republic of Free Nagaland in 1954, that morphed into the Naga Central Government in 1956, later renamed the Federal Government of Nagaland with its military wing. The movement split in 1955 when Sakri and J.B. Jasoki, two Angami leaders of the NNC, disavowed Pawsey's direction of travel. Sakri was murdered in January 1956. Pawsey was thought by many to be involved, and by the end of 1956, he'd fled firstly to East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and then to London, where he lived the rest of his life in political exile. The following 60 years have seen violent clashes between secessionists and the Indian authorities, and between different Naga factions wax and wane. The Indian government has been criticised for its heavy-handedness, most significantly over the 1958 Armed Forces Special Powers Act and the heavy presence of the Assam Rifles. The creation of the state of Nagaland in 1963 was seen by some Nagas as a step in the right direction, and by others as a sop to Naga aspiration. As he looked on from Woodbridge, Pawsey remained true to his belief that the Nagas should find an accommodation within the new India. He was not blind to the heavy-handed measures used by the Indian government during phases of insurgency, writing with disgust in correspondence to friends about the atrocities. Sadly, the aftermath of empires in the last 100 years has not always been kind to peoples with small populations and strong cultural identities. Pawsey's reputation was so strong that the Indian government, supported by Naga peace factions, invited him to visit Kohima in February and March 1965. His wife wrote to Sir Arthur Swinson that he'd gone to, quote, knock some sense into the rebels. It was hoped that he could help negotiate a peaceful end to the chronic violence. He stayed a month in Nagaland, working hard to find points of agreement between the factions and visiting many old friends. He was welcomed with great joy everywhere he went. One stopover was at the home of P.E. Etsung, a leading member of the NNC and proponent of a negotiated settlement. His daughter remembers Dobashis and the Gwangons, appointed by Pawsey, arriving for a feast that lasted all night. The guests brought copious quantities of rice wine, she remembers. In the end, though, this is rather a non sequitur, he could do nothing to reconcile opposing positions, and he left Nagaland without success, fighting against Indian government forces and between Naga factions sadly continued. This photograph is of Pawsey in 1965 with his Dobashis behind him. They're wearing red cloaks, and someone has kindly coloured in the photograph. It's not as clear as the one I'm showing you now, but that would have been a little bit what it was like to be a Dobashi wearing your fabulous red cloak given you by the government. So Pawsey's final moment as an influence in Nagaland passed, and the hero of 1944 had become almost irrelevant 20 years later, however much he was loved. Yet Britain understood the insurgency crisis better than he did. He lived among the Naga while their way of life was uprooted by war, and saw the onrush of independence that galloped over their aspirations as the British left in such haste. He knew too that his government wasn't lacking in compassion, just bandwidth. But if he couldn't help in 1965, his name remains cherished amongst Nagas to this day for his extraordinary courage in 1944. He knew that when they scouted and laboured and brought in injured soldiers and airmen and fought, the Nagas would not have thought of themselves as being loyal to the British so much as being loyal to friends. Sir Charles Pawsey was indeed their friend. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Steve, for that excellent overview of what was a remarkable man, and as somebody's just said, with a brilliant career. I'm sure you've got lots of questions, and we'll be very happy to take some if you'd like. I think Rob's going to manage the questions tonight.
Yes, so if you've got a question, just stick it in the Q&A on your screen, and we'll do what we can to answer them. All the curly questions I'll give straight to Steve, and I'll answer the easy ones. But we've got a couple of minutes if you want to send a question through. I mean, it really is an extraordinary career. I was struck, Steve, by the reality that actually he was one in a number of actually remarkable anthropologists. He wasn't an anthropologist himself. He wouldn't have declared himself to be an anthropologist, but he was. And I mean, you mentioned J.H. Hutton and J.P. Mills, of course, two remarkable men who were, J.P. Mills was contemporaneous with him, who made such a remarkable impact on the Nagas, but also on our appreciation of the Nagas. And we have this view, I think, of these deputy commissioners or district commissioners in other places as being the heavy hand of the Raj, but it's quite clear that that simply wasn't the case. They were there to settle disputes and to enable the Nagas to live as friends. The question from Nick Short is, did Pawsey take an active part in the Battle of Kohima? And I'll give that back to you, Stephen.
He didn't fight, but his active part, so to speak, was making sure that the troops on the ridge during the siege were told as much as they could learn about what was going on outside the ridge, what the disposition of the Japanese troops were, how many there were, which direction they were coming from, and so on and so forth. And also being the link with the Nagas, that information he got from the Nagas, and the link with the Nagas as they brought in downed airmen or people that needed help, or brought in supplies if they possibly could. I think his role as a, I don't know, as a calming force. I think the quotes that I made, there are many others about him being so insouciant, just walking about. I mean, it seems quite extraordinary. He seemed to have no fear, and I think it's having gone through the war, many men who went through the trenches in the way he did, from beginning to end pretty well, had that sort of, it's not carelessness, it's they've seen it. And they know it face to face. And he wasn't going to be cowed by it. And because he wasn't cowed by it, as Private Street indicated, he made others feel braver and kept their chins up. So he played a part. He didn't shoot. Didn't fight.
One of the extraordinary things that a number of us have seen was the Union flag that flew over his trench on Summerhouse Hill during the battle, was returned to Britain for a period of time in 2010, about the time that Fergal Keane was publishing The Road of Bones, and it really is quite extraordinary. It's now back in Kohima in the museum, but it was full of holes. It was an extraordinary artifact. John Hinchcliffe from Padstow. Hello, John, nice to see you here. Did he leave a family, Steve, that could carry his name on?
No, he had no children. He married late, and his wife was a widow. I don't know if she had children from her first marriage, but he didn't. Although Esme Mitchell, who is a cousin once removed, I think, of Charles Pawsey, says that the Pawseys are a massive clan in Suffolk, a large East Anglian family. So there will be a number of people who probably remember him or remember hearing of him from their parents who are Pawseys, but he himself didn't have children.
And John Keyes, my friend and the great Indian historian, is a cousin of Charles Pawsey as well. And we've got time for one more. We've got one from Robert Albright. Did Ursula Graham Bauer work directly for Charles Pawsey? And he comments, she originally went to Nagaland as an anthropologist.
Yes, she didn't work with him directly, but they knew one another and spent quite a bit of time with each other, as I think would be the case with someone of her standing and an anthropologist in the area. But no, they didn't work together, and she certainly didn't report to him or vice versa.
Yes, it was a matter that the Deputy Commissions for the Hills reported to the Commission for Hill Tribes in Delhi, although they did try, as Stephen has said, to spend as much time with each other and to collaborate where they could. Well, thank you very much for those questions. If you've got any more that you would like to ask Steve in particular, then email them through to Sylvia and we'll arrange to have them answered in the next few days. Sylvia, back to you.
Well done, Rob. Thank you, Steve, again. Well, as you've heard tonight, the Nagas liked and respected their Deputy Commissioner, and he was probably one of the main reasons why they were so loyal and helpful to the British soldiers. Pawsey stayed and they stayed. And now KET, as many of you know, we try to reciprocate, and the idea of the British veterans that fought in that battle wanted to assist those young Nagas of today, descendants of those from Pawsey's time, by raising money to create scholarships and help with healthcare training. If you've enjoyed this evening, you may want to have a look at our shop. Here comes the sales pitch. Don't go home just yet. On our website, where we have lots of new items for sale, with more arriving all the time. Our new line of Christmas cards has just arrived, which are now available to purchase, and beautifully handcrafted in Naga homes. And we also have specially commissioned Kohima poppy pins available, which there is still time to order, hopefully. I'll get to you before Remembrance Sunday. And all of Rob's books are also for sale here, along with beautifully made bags and shawls, all from Nagaland. All profits from the sale of these goods go directly to our work in Nagaland. And alternatively, you may simply wish to make a donation. The webinars are free to view, but if you have enjoyed the talk tonight and wish to make a donation, this QR code will take you through to the donate button on our website. As I said, it couldn't be easier. Well, thank you for joining us this evening. Our next webinar is scheduled for November the 24th, when Robert Palmer will be discussing the role of armoured warfare in the Burma campaign. We look forward to seeing you then. Good night.